In October 2024, Richmond was buzzing with election fever. With a population of nearly 1.5 million, the city was gearing up to elect a new mayor, and political tension was palpable on every street. Campaign posters adorned lampposts, and coffee shops in the business district hummed with discussions about the candidates and their platforms. Richard Coleman knew that this was his moment. At 45, he had already served 8 years on the Richmond City Council, establishing himself as a pragmatic politician with conservative views and a knack for compromise. His office on the 12th floor of an administrative building overlooked the James River, and every morning, sipping his coffee, he imagined himself sitting in the mayor's chair. "We must restore Richmond's moral compass," he told his aides during morning briefings. His campaign was built on promises to strengthen traditional family values, reduce crime, and attract new investment to the city. Polls showed that he had a real chance of winning. At home, in a spacious 2-story house in the prestigious West End neighborhood, he was supported by his wife, Sydney. At 42, she remained an attractive woman with impeccable manners and a sharp mind. Sydney headed the local branch of the charity organization Women for Family Values and was an active member of St. John's Baptist Church. Her social activities perfectly complemented her husband's political image. "Honey, the Tribune reporters want to do a story on our family," she told Richard over breakfast on a sunny October morning. "They think it will help the campaign." Richard nodded, glancing at the morning news on his tablet. "Sure, we're a model family. We have nothing to hide." Sydney smiled, adjusting her perfectly styled hair. Their marriage had lasted 18 years, and on the surface, it looked perfect. They attended church regularly, participated in charity events, and Sydney always accompanied her husband to official receptions. They had no children, a topic they preferred not to discuss even between themselves. On the same day, at an office center on Broad Street, Roxana Martinez began her first day of work in Richmond. At 28, she was a talented business development manager at Fletcher Associates, a large consulting firm. The move from Atlanta had been difficult, but the career prospects in Richmond looked promising. Roxana was a tall, slender woman with long, dark hair and expressive eyes. She had completed her transgender transition 5 years earlier, and now few would suspect that she had not been born a woman. But her experience living in conservative regions had taught her to be cautious. In Richmond, she decided to start with a clean slate, without revealing her history. Her new office was on the 20th floor, with an impressive view of the city. Her colleagues welcomed her warmly, and management made it clear that they were counting on her professionalism in working with large corporate clients. "Richmond is a city of opportunity," Company Director David Fletcher told her during their introductory meeting. "There are many influential people here who need our services. Politicians, business people, public figures. I hope you quickly find common ground with the local elite." Roxana nodded, mentally noting the challenge. Working with politicians always required special delicacy, especially during an election period. Their first meeting happened by chance. On Wednesday evening, Richard stopped by the Blue Moon, a respectable bar in the business district where politicians and businessmen often gathered. He was supposed to meet with potential campaign sponsors there, but they were running late. An attractive stranger was sitting at the bar, sipping a martini and looking through documents on her tablet. Her professional suit and confident manner immediately set her apart from the other patrons. "Working late?" Richard asked, sitting down next to her and ordering a whiskey. Roxana looked up and smiled. "First week on the job, trying to get a feel for the local market." "Welcome to Richmond, Richard Coleman," he said, extending his hand. "Roxana Martinez, nice to meet you." The conversation flowed naturally. Richard talked about the city, its history, and its prospects for development, while Roxana shared her impressions of the move. She was an intelligent conversationalist and asked interesting questions about local politics and the economy. When the late sponsors finally arrived, Richard almost regretted the interruption. "It was nice talking to you," he said as he stood up. I hope we meet again. Richmond isn't that big of a city, Roxana replied with a mysterious smile. The following week, fate brought them together again. At a charity auction for the city hospital held at the Jefferson Hotel, Richard spotted Roxana among the guests. She was wearing an elegant black dress, and several men were already trying to strike up a conversation with her. Sydney, as usual, was engrossed in conversation with the ladies from the church committee and did not notice her husband heading toward a familiar businesswoman. I didn't expect to see you here, Richard said, approaching Roxana. My boss bought a table. He thinks it's important to maintain ties with the local community, she explained. Besides, charity is a noble cause. They spent most of the evening talking. Roxana turned out to be not only beautiful, but also a truly intelligent woman. She was knowledgeable about economics, art history, and could hold a conversation on any topic. With her, Richard felt like more than just a politician playing a role, but a real person with his own interests and passions. When Sydney finally came over to introduce herself, the introduction was perfectly polite, but Richard noticed how closely his wife was studying Roxana. A charming woman, Sydney remarked on the way home. Where is she from? She's new in town. She works for a consulting firm, Richard replied, trying to sound indifferent. But Sydney had not lived 18 years married to a politician for nothing. She knew how to read between the lines and notice things that others overlooked. Something about her husband's behavior that evening struck her as odd. Meanwhile, journalist Thomas Kane of the Richmond Tribune was preparing a major story on the election campaign. A young, ambitious reporter, he dreamed of a serious career in journalism and knew that political scandals were the best way to make a name for himself. His sources in City Hall and the police regularly supplied him with inside information, and his keen nose for news had already earned him several high-profile publications. At the end of October, he noticed Richard Coleman visiting the Blue Moon twice in 1 week, unusual for a married politician who usually preferred more formal establishments. Thomas made a mental note to follow up on this. Detective Sarah Mitchell didn't know then that she was about to be plunged into the world of big politics and family secrets. 18 years on the Richmond police force had taught her that in a city where money and power go hand in hand, crimes often have complex backgrounds. But for now, October 2024 was a normal month for her. Robberies, drugs, domestic violence. The standard fare for a large American city. She couldn't have known that the lives of all these people, a successful politician and his perfect wife, a beautiful businesswoman with a secret past, an ambitious journalist, would soon be intertwined in a tragedy that would rock Richmond and destroy several lives at once. For now, the city was going about its usual business. The election campaign was gaining momentum, business centers were buzzing with activity, and in prestigious neighborhoods, couples were making plans for the future. No one suspected that beneath the visible prosperity lay passions and secrets that would soon come to light in the most tragic way. November brought the first frosts to Richmond and intensified election activity. 3 weeks before the vote, Richard Coleman's campaign was in full swing. His face was on billboards all over the city, and election rallies drew hundreds of supporters. But behind his public confidence lay inner turmoil that he could not admit even to himself. His meetings with Roxana became regular. At first, they were casual, at the same Blue Moon, at a coffee shop near her office, at public events. Richard convinced himself that these were just business acquaintances. Roxana worked with influential clients, and it was politically savvy to stay in touch with her. "How's the campaign going?" she asked during their third chance meeting at the Metropolitan coffee shop in the city center. Richard noticed how elegantly she held her cup, how attentively she listened to his answers. "It's difficult. The competition is fierce," he admitted. "Sometimes it feels like you're playing a role that isn't quite you." Roxana looked at him intently. "What are you really like?" The question caught Richard off guard. Over the years in politics, he had grown accustomed to stock answers, carefully crafted phrases. but Roxana asked questions that made him think about things he had long buried beneath layers of his public persona. "I don't know," he replied honestly. "Sometimes I feel like I lost myself somewhere between election campaigns." In the weeks that followed, their meetings became more frequent and candid. Richard discovered that with Roxana he could be himself. Not a politician, not the husband of a model wife, but simply a man with his own doubts and desires. She told him about her work, about moving from Atlanta, about how difficult it was to start a new life in a new city. "You have a beautiful family," she remarked one day when she saw the family photo on his phone's home screen. Richard looked at the photo. It was him and Sydney at a charity dinner, both smiling at the camera, the perfect couple. "Yes, Sydney is a wonderful woman. We've been together for 18 years. "That's a long time," Roxana said softly. There was no judgment in her voice, only understanding. Richard felt something like relief. For the first time in years, he had met a woman who didn't require him to live up to an image. With Roxana, he could admit that he was tired of constantly playing a role, that he had doubts about his political convictions, that he felt lonely even when surrounded by people. The internal conflict grew with each passing day. In the morning, Richard spoke at rallies, talking about traditional family values and the importance of moral choices. During the day, he met with voters, promising to be the voice of the conservative majority. And in the evening, his thoughts invariably returned to Roxana, to her smile, to the way she listened to him, to the feeling of freedom he felt when he was with her. "We must protect the institution of the family from the destructive trends of modern times," he said from the pulpit of the Baptist church, looking at Sydney in the front row. She nodded, proud of her husband, and he felt like a hypocrite. The psychological strain was affecting his behavior at home. Sydney, an observant and intuitive woman, began to notice the changes. Richard became distracted, checked his phone frequently, and stayed late at work. Their conversations, once filled with discussions of plans and political strategies, became formal and superficial. "You seem tired," she remarked one evening when Richard was once again buried in his phone, instead of discussing the guest list for the election reception. "The campaign takes a lot of energy," he replied without looking up. Sydney studied his face. 20 years of marriage had taught her to read his moods. Something had changed, but she couldn't figure out what. "Maybe we should take a little vacation after the election. Go somewhere together?" "We'll see," Richard replied vaguely. In the past, such a suggestion would have delighted him. Now, the thought of traveling with his wife only intensified his feelings of guilt and inner conflict. Meanwhile, his relationship with Roxana was deepening, although outwardly it remained within the bounds of friendly communication. They met in public places, discussed work, politics, art, but there was a growing tension between them that both felt but did not name. "Tell me about your past life," Richard asked during one of their meetings. Roxana froze for a moment. "Not everything from the past is worth discussing. What matters is who we are now, not who we were before." Richard nodded, understanding her reluctance to reveal personal details. He himself preferred not to talk about how his true feelings were increasingly at odds with his public statements. At the end of November, their relationship moved to a new level. After another election event, which Roxana attended as a representative of the business community, they found themselves alone in the elevator of an office building. "Thank you for coming," Richard said. "I support your ideas for the development of the city," she replied, but there was something more than political sympathy in her voice. They stood close together, and for the first time Richard allowed himself to look at her not as a politician looking at a voter, but as a man looking at an attractive woman. A moment of tension hung between them that could have changed everything. But the elevator stopped, the doors opened, and the moment passed. However, something irreparable had already happened. Both realized that their relationship could no longer be called simply friendly. The risks to Richard's political career were growing, and not just because of his developing relationship with Roxana. Thomas Kane of the Richmond Tribune was continuing his informal investigation. The young journalist had a nose for scandal and understood that in an election period, any compromising information could cost a candidate their seat. His sources reported regular meetings between Coleman and an unknown woman. So far, there were no concrete facts, but Thomas knew the value of rumors in politics. He began to carefully gather information about the mayoral candidate's personal life. "I've seen Coleman at Blue Moon 3 times this month," the bartender, whom Thomas occasionally fed information, told him. "Always with the same woman. Pretty, businesslike, doesn't look like his wife." Thomas jotted down the details in his notebook. Nothing concrete yet, but the investigation had begun. Sydney also began her own investigation, although she didn't call it that. She simply began to watch her husband more closely. His late returns home, constant phone messages, and distraction during conversations all added up to a disturbing picture. When she found a business card for a restaurant they had never been to together in his jacket pocket, her suspicions grew. And when Richard lied about a meeting with potential sponsors, which turned out not to have happened, Sydney realized that something serious was going on. "Honey, maybe we should spend more time together," she suggested over dinner. "The campaign is important, but so is our marriage." Richard looked up from his plate. He heard a note of alarm in his wife's voice that he hadn't noticed before. "Of course, everything will change after the election." But Sydney was too smart to believe such promises. She understood that if something was happening now, the election wouldn't stop it, and might even make it worse. December brought not only the approaching election, but also increased tension in all relationships. Richard felt torn between 3 worlds: his public image as a politician, his obligations as a husband, and his growing feelings for Roxana. Every day demanded new compromises with his conscience. At one of the election rallies, while talking about the importance of honesty in politics, he saw Roxana in the audience. Their eyes met, and Richard felt his voice falter. He was talking about honesty, but he himself was living a lie. After the event, they met at a coffee shop. "Is it difficult to be a politician?" Roxana asked. "It's difficult to be an honest politician," Richard replied. "Sometimes it seems like the system requires you to betray yourself." "What if you don't betray yourself?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Richard understood that Roxana was not just talking about politics. She was talking about them, about their relationship, about the choice between the safety of lies and the risk of truth. But the truth seemed too dangerous. A scandal could destroy not only his career, but also Sydney's reputation, ruining everything they had built over the years. Richard did not yet know that his hesitation between honesty and caution would lead to a tragedy that would make any compromise impossible. The city was preparing for the election, unaware that the lives of several people were already entangled in a web of passion and lies that would soon lead to irreversible consequences. The first week of December brought snowstorms and political fever to Richmond. There were 2 weeks left before the election, and Richard Coleman's team was working around the clock. Polls showed him in the lead, but his lead over his closest rival was shrinking. Every day, every public appearance could be decisive. But Richard's inner world was in chaos. His meetings with Roxana became daily, and he could no longer deceive himself about his feelings. What had started as an innocent acquaintance had turned into an emotional connection that threatened to destroy all his carefully constructed plans. "I need to tell you something," Roxana said during their meeting in a small cafe on the outskirts of town, where they had moved to avoid the central areas and possible encounters with acquaintances. Richard sensed the tension in her voice. Over the months they had known each other, he had learned to read her moods, to notice the slightest changes in her tone of voice. "I'm listening," he replied, putting down his coffee cup. Roxana was silent for a long time, staring out the window at the falling snow. "You know I moved here from Atlanta, but I never told you why." Richard's heart began to beat faster. He knew he was about to hear something important, something that could change everything between them. 5 years ago, I completed my gender transition, Roxana said quietly, without looking away from the window. I am a transgender woman. I was born in a male body, but I've always known who I really am. The silence stretched on for what seemed like an eternity. Richard felt his world turning upside down. A politician who had built his career on traditional values had fallen in love with a transgender woman. The irony was cruel. "Why are you telling me this?" he finally asked. "Because there's something between us." Roxana turned to him. "And you have a right to know the truth before we go any further." Richard looked at her face. Beautiful, feminine, open. Nothing had changed outwardly, but inside, everything had been turned upside down. His conservative beliefs, which he had preached for years, were colliding with his real feelings for a living person. "It doesn't change anything," he said, surprised by his own words. "It changes everything," Roxana replied. "You're a politician, Richard, a conservative politician. If this gets out—" She didn't finish her sentence, but they both understood the consequences. Richard's political career would be destroyed instantly. The scandal would affect not only him, but also Sydney, their family, and everyone who had supported his campaign. "I need time to think," Richard said, getting up from the table. "Of course," Roxana nodded. "But think honestly, about who you really are, not who you think you should be." The drive home seemed endless to Richard. Thoughts he couldn't sort out swirled around in his head. He loved this woman. He knew that for sure, but this love could cost him everything. At home, Sydney was waiting for him with a serious expression on her face. Printed phone bills and credit card statements were lying on the kitchen table. "We need to talk," she said. Richard felt his stomach tighten. "About what?" "About your meetings with unknown women in cafes and bars all over the city," Sydney said, picking up one of the bills. "About expenses at restaurants we've never been to. About calls during working hours that aren't in your official schedule." Richard sat down across from his wife, realizing that the moment of confession had come. Sydney had conducted her own investigation and gathered enough evidence. "Who is she?" Sydney asked bluntly. "What do you mean?" "Don't play games with me, Richard. 18 years of marriage gives me the right to honesty. Who is this woman?" Richard looked at his wife. Beautiful, intelligent, devoted. A woman who had dedicated her life to his career, who had stood by his side at every rally, every official event, and he had betrayed her. "Her name is Roxana. We just meet to talk." "Talk?" Sydney smiled. "Every day? In different parts of the city? Secretly? It's not what you think." "What do I think, Richard? That my husband, a man who publicly preaches family values, is having an affair in the middle of an election campaign?" His wife's words hit him like a slap in the face. Richard realized he could no longer lie to her or to himself. "Yes," he said quietly. "There is something between us." Sydney closed her eyes as if she had been physically struck. When she opened them again, there was a pain in them that Richard had never seen before. "How could you?" she whispered. "How could you do this to me? To us? To our family?" "Sydney, No!" She stood up abruptly. "Don't you dare make excuses. You've ruined everything. Our marriage, your career, my reputation. For what? For a casual affair?" "It's not a casual affair," Richard replied, surprised at his own candor. Sydney looked at him incredulously. "What do you mean?" "I'm in love with her." The words hung in the air like a sentence. Sydney sank into a chair, realizing the magnitude of the disaster. "Do you understand what this means?" she asked after a long silence. "The election is in 2 weeks. If this gets out—" "I know." "You know?" Sydney's voice rose. "And you don't care? You don't care about everything we've built over the years?" Richard couldn't answer. He knew the consequences, but he couldn't control his feelings. Meanwhile, Thomas Kane was closing in on the truth. His investigation had yielded concrete results. Sources in the city confirmed Richard Coleman's regular meetings with a mysterious woman. Bartenders, waiters, concierges, everyone remembered the attractive couple who were clearly hiding their relationship. Her name is Roxana Martinez, the private investigator Thomas had hired with his own money told him. She's a manager at Fletcher Associates. She moved here from Atlanta a few months ago. Thomas studied the photos taken from a distance. A beautiful woman, professional, confident. But something about her appearance struck him as odd. He couldn't put his finger on it, but his journalist's instinct told him there was more to the story than met the eye. "Keep digging," he told the detective. "I need everything you can find out about her past. In Atlanta, in college, everywhere." The private investigator nodded. "That will cost extra. I'll pay. This story could be a breakthrough." At the Richmond Tribune newsroom, editor-in-chief James Harrison already sensed a scoop. Young Kane was working on something big, and if his suspicions were confirmed, the newspaper would get an exclusive that could influence the election. "How much time do you need?" he asked Thomas. "Another week, maybe less. It depends on what the detective finds." "You have a week. After that, we go to press with what we have." At the Coleman house, the atmosphere became unbearable. After Richard's confession, Sydney locked herself in her bedroom and didn't come out all day. When she finally emerged, her face was red from crying, but her eyes were steely. "We have two options," she said to her husband. "Either you stop seeing her immediately and we try to save our marriage and your career, or I file for divorce right now and your political career ends in scandal." Richard understood the logic of her words, but his heart protested against the ultimatum. "Sydney, it's not that simple." "It is that simple," she interrupted. "Choose, family and career or this woman. Give me time to think." "Time?" Sydney laughed bitterly. "You had time to think months ago when you decided to start this affair. Now it's time to make a choice." That evening, Richard met Roxana at their usual cafe. She immediately noticed his depressed state. "What happened?" "Sydney knows," he said simply. Roxana nodded as if she had expected it. "And now what?" "She's demanding that I make a choice between my family and you." "And you? What do you want?" Richard was silent for a long time, staring at her hands resting on the table. They were elegant, feminine hands that she wanted to take in hers. "I want to be with you," he said finally. "But it's impossible." "Why?" "Because I'm a politician. Because I have a reputation. Because society isn't ready to accept a relationship like this." "Society or you?" Roxana asked quietly. That question struck at the heart of his inner conflict. Richard preached traditional values not only to his constituents but also to himself. His own prejudices were at war with his feelings. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. In the days that followed, the situation continued to deteriorate. Sydney stopped showing up at campaign events, citing illness. Richard's team grew concerned. The absence of the mayoral candidate's wife during the crucial days of the campaign could raise questions among voters and journalists. "Where's Sydney?" his supporters asked. "Why isn't she around?" "She's a little tired from the intensity of the campaign," Richard replied, but he knew how unconvincing that sounded. Meanwhile, Thomas Kane's private investigator made a breakthrough in the investigation. After studying Atlanta's archives, he discovered information that could blow up the Richmond political scene. "Roxana Martinez changed her name 5 years ago," he told a reporter. "She used to be called Robert Martinez. She is a transgender woman." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. A conservative politician who preached traditional family values was having an affair with a transgender woman. It was a bombshell that could not only destroy Coleman's career, but also divide the entire city. "Are you sure about this information?" he asked again. "Absolutely. There are documents, witnesses, medical records. Everything is ironclad." Thomas knew he was holding a story that would make his career, but he also understood the consequences of publishing it. This wasn't just a political scandal. It was a story about human lives, about love and prejudice, about the price of being yourself in a world that wasn't ready to accept you. In the newsroom, he sat down to write the article that would change everything. Outside, snow continued to fall on Richmond, unaware of the storm that was about to hit the city. The time for decision was coming to an end. Richard, Sydney, Roxana, all of them stood on the brink of a catastrophe that would change their lives forever. No one knew yet that the worst was yet to come. Snow fell on Richmond all night from December 15th to 16th, turning the city into a winter wonderland. But the morning brought a tragedy that shook the entire political establishment and changed the lives of many people forever. At 7:30 a.m., neighbors heard a gunshot coming from Roxana Martinez's apartment on the 23rd floor of the upscale Richmond Heights apartment complex in the city center. Jennifer Walsh, who lived in the apartment next door, initially thought it was a burst heating pipe, a common occurrence in older buildings. But a few minutes later, she heard screams and realized that something serious had happened. Patrol officers Michael Rodriguez and Emma Carter were the first to arrive at the scene. The apartment door was ajar, and they cautiously entered, keeping their hands on their holsters. What they saw made even the experienced police officers shudder. Roxana Martinez lay on the floor of the spacious living room in the elegant black dress she had worn to a business meeting the day before. She had been shot in the chest, and it was clear that she was beyond help. There were no signs of a struggle around the body. The furniture was in place and expensive paintings hung neatly on the walls. "Call for detectives," Rodriguez said to his partner. "And the crime scene unit. This is definitely a murder." Detective Sarah Mitchell received the call at 8:15 a.m. while having breakfast at home with her husband before he left on a business trip. 18 years of service with the Richmond Police Department had taught her to switch instantly from her normal life to professional mode. "Murder in Richmond Heights," the dispatcher reported. "Young woman, single gunshot wound to the chest." Sarah kissed her husband goodbye, and 20 minutes later was riding the elevator up to the victim's apartment. Tall and slender with piercing gray eyes, she was skilled at noticing details that others overlooked. The crime scene struck her with its almost theatrical composition. The apartment was expensively furnished. Leather furniture, modern art on the walls, panoramic windows overlooking the James River. Everything spoke of the owner's wealth and refined taste. "What do we have?" Sarah asked Rodriguez. Roxana Martinez, 28 years old, manager at Fletcher Associates. A neighbor heard a gunshot around 7:30 this morning. The door was ajar, no signs of forced entry. Sarah examined the body carefully. Roxana was a beautiful woman, and even death couldn't completely erase that impression. The shot had been fired at close range. Gunpowder residue on the fabric of the dress confirmed this. "Where's the weapon?" she asked. "Not found. The killer took it with them." Sarah nodded, making notes in her notebook. The absence of a weapon indicated that the murder had been premeditated. This was not a spontaneous act of violence. Forensic investigators had already begun their work, photographing the crime scene from different angles. Sarah walked around the apartment, studying the surroundings. There were 2 coffee cups on the kitchen table, one almost full, the other half empty. This meant that the victim had had a visitor shortly before her death. "Interesting," Sarah muttered, putting on latex gloves and carefully picking up the cups. Was she expecting someone, or did someone come unexpectedly? In the bedroom, a cell phone lay on the nightstand, still on. The last incoming call was at 11:47 p.m. the night before from an unknown number. Sarah wrote down the number for further investigation. At 9:30 a.m., medical examiner Dr. William Haynes, Sarah's longtime colleague, arrived. A tall, gray-haired man, he examined the body with professional thoroughness. "Preliminary findings indicate that death occurred between 7 and 8 this morning," he reported. "A single gunshot wound to the heart from a distance of about a meter. The caliber is most likely .38. I'll have more details after the autopsy." Sarah wrote down the information and turned to the patrol officers. Let's start interviewing the neighbors. I need to know who entered and left the building last night and this morning. The first results of the interview yielded interesting information. The building security guard, Michael Thompson, remembered that around 10:30 p.m., an elegant middle-aged woman went up to Roxana's apartment. Blonde, well-dressed, he described. She said she was going to see Miss Martinez on business. I didn't ask any questions. Many residents bring business associates to their homes. Had you seen her before? No, it was the first time. But she looked respectable and knew the apartment number. What time did she leave? The security guard thought for a moment. I don't remember exactly. My shift ended at midnight. She may have left after that. Sarah asked to see the CCTV footage, but it turned out that the system had been malfunctioning due to a recent software update. The recordings from the last 2 days were corrupted. At 10:45, Thomas Kane from the Richmond Tribune called the police station. The young journalist had learned about the murder from his sources in the police and realized that it might be related to his investigation. Detective Mitchell, this is Thomas Kane from the Tribune. I'm working on a story that may be related to the murder of Roxana Martinez. Sarah frowned. Journalists always showed up at the worst possible moment, but sometimes they had useful information. What kind of story? I can't reveal all the details, but Miss Martinez had, shall we say, a delicate relationship with a prominent politician. Who exactly? Thomas hesitated. The publication of his investigation was scheduled for the next day, but the murder changed everything. Richard Coleman, the mayoral candidate. Sarah sensed that the case was getting complicated. Politicians, secret romances, murder on the eve of an election. It all promised to be a media circus. I need to meet with you, she said, and bring all your investigation materials. At noon, an agitated Richard Coleman arrived at the station, accompanied by his lawyer. He had heard about the murder on the news and knew he would immediately be suspected. Sarah met them in the interrogation room, a small room with gray walls and fluorescent lighting. Richard looked shaken, his usual political confidence gone. Mr. Coleman, did you know Roxana Martinez? Sarah began. Yes, he replied after glancing at his lawyer. We were acquainted. When did you last see her? The night before last, at the Metropolitan Cafe. What did you talk about? Richard hesitated. Telling the truth meant admitting to an affair, which would destroy his career. But withholding information in a murder case was even more dangerous. We had a personal relationship, he finally said. Of what nature? Romantic. The lawyer put his hand on his client's shoulder, but Richard continued. I know how it looks, but I didn't kill her. I loved her. Sarah wrote down the answer, studying the politician's face. Years of experience had taught her to read people, and Richard seemed genuinely shaken. Where were you this morning between 7 and 8 o'clock? At home, sleeping. Who can confirm that? My wife, Sydney. Did your wife know about the affair? Richard nodded. She found out recently. We discussed it. After questioning Richard, Sarah contacted Sydney Coleman and asked her to come in for questioning. The politician's wife arrived an hour later, an elegant woman in a dark suit, her makeup flawless, hiding the traces of sleepless nights. Mrs. Coleman, did you know about your husband's affair? Sarah asked. Yes, Sydney replied in an even voice. He confessed a few days ago. How did you react? Naturally, I was upset, but it's a family matter. Have you met Roxana Martinez? Sydney hesitated for a moment. I've seen her at social events, but we're not close. Where were you this morning? At home. I was making breakfast for my husband. What time? From 7 to 8:30. Sarah noticed a slight discrepancy. Richard had said he slept until 8, but Sydney claimed she had been making breakfast for him since 7. But it could have been a simple mix-up. By midday, news of the murder had spread throughout the city. Richard Coleman's campaign headquarters was in chaos. Supporters demanded explanations, rivals hinted at the candidate's involvement in the crime, and journalists besieged the campaign office. "This is a disaster," said campaign manager David Stratton. "Even if Richard wasn't involved in the murder, the fact that he had an affair will kill him politically." At the Richmond Tribune, editor-in-chief James Harrison decided to speed up the publication of Thomas Kane's article. "We're going to tomorrow's paper with the full story," he announced. "A politician's affair with a transgender woman who was then murdered. It's the story of the century." Thomas understood the importance of the moment, but he felt uncomfortable. What had started as a political investigation had turned into a tragedy with human casualties. That evening, Sarah studied the collected material in her office. Photos of the crime scene, a floor plan of the apartment, and notes from interviews hung on the board. The picture was gradually coming together, but many details remained unclear. Phone records showed that Roxana's last call was from an unknown number. A check revealed that it was a taxi company. Someone had ordered a car to an address near her home. Fingerprint analysis in the apartment revealed traces of several people, but most belonged to the victim herself. Several unidentified fingerprints were found on the door handle and kitchen cups. The killer knew the victim, Sarah mused aloud. Roxana opened the door voluntarily and offered coffee. That shows trust. The motive remained unclear. There was no robbery. Expensive jewelry and electronics were left untouched. This was a murder with a personal motive. By the end of the day, another important clue emerged. In a trash can next to the building, forensic experts found a pair of women's gloves with minor traces of gunpowder. The gloves were expensive, leather and small, women's size. "Our killer is a woman," Sarah concluded, "or a very neat man with small hands." At night, Richmond froze in anticipation. The city, accustomed to political scandals, was not ready for a murder in the middle of an election campaign. In the morning, the newspapers were set to come out with sensational headlines, and the police were to continue their investigation, which promised to reveal not only the killer, but also the dark secrets of the city's elite. Detective Sarah Mitchell fell asleep, thinking about what tomorrow would bring in a case that had already become the most high-profile of her career. She did not yet know that the truth would be more terrifying than any of her wildest imaginings. The morning of December 17th brought new revelations in the Roxana Martinez murder case. Detective Sarah Mitchell arrived at the station at 6 in the morning, unable to sleep after the previous day's events. Her intuition told her that the answer was close, but she needed to analyze all the evidence with particular care. First, she examined the results of the examination of the gloves found in the trash can. They were Italian-made leather gloves, size 6.5, with microscopic traces of gunpowder and a single light-colored fiber on the inside. More interesting was the fact that the gloves were practically new with minimal wear, suggesting that they had been used infrequently or purchased recently. "Check the high-end clothing stores in town," Sarah instructed her assistant detective, Mark Davis. "These gloves are worth at least $200. There aren't many stores like that in Richmond." At 8:30, the results of the fingerprint analysis came back. Forensic scientist Robert Chang found a partial print on the inside handle of the front door, a place that is usually touched when leaving an apartment. "The print is incomplete but clear enough for comparison," he explained to Sarah. "Judging by the size and papillary lines, it belongs to a woman." Sarah asked for the print to be checked against the database, as well as against the prints of everyone who had been in the apartment after the body was discovered. The results came back an hour later. There were no matches in the database, but the print did not belong to any police officers or forensic scientists. At that moment, Detective Davis returned with good news. At the Elegance Boutique on Grace Street, a saleswoman remembered a customer who had purchased the exact same gloves 3 days earlier. An elegant blonde, about 40 years old, the saleswoman described Melanie Foster. Very well dressed, paid cash. She said the gloves were for a special occasion. "Have you seen her before?" "Her face looked familiar, but I couldn't place her. Now I realize she's often in the society pages. She's the wife of some politician." Sarah felt the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. She asked for photos of all the wives of local politicians, including Sydney Coleman. "Yes, that's her," exclaimed the saleswoman when she saw Sydney's photo. "I remember her well, a very aristocratic lady." The first concrete clue linking Sydney to the crime scene had emerged. But Sarah knew that buying gloves was not proof of murder. She needed more solid evidence. At noon, the results of the phone call analysis came in. The mysterious call Roxana received at 11:47 p.m. was not from a taxi company, as originally assumed. The number belonged to a prepaid phone purchased with cash at an electronics store 3 days earlier. Someone planned this in advance, Sarah thought. They bought gloves and an anonymous phone. This was a planned murder. Fortunately, the security cameras in the electronics store were working properly. The recording showed a woman wearing sunglasses and a hat buying a prepaid phone. Her height, build, and mannerisms resembled Sydney Coleman, but her face was poorly visible. Sarah decided to look into Sydney's alibi more closely. The woman claimed she had been at home from 7 to 8:30 a.m., making breakfast for her husband. But Richard said he had slept until 8 o'clock and had not seen his wife that morning. The detective went to the Coleman home in the prestigious West End neighborhood. The spacious two-story mansion with a well-kept garden gave the impression of a happy family. But Sarah knew that appearances could be deceiving. She questioned the neighbors. Mrs. Eleanor Baker, who lived across the street, was an observant and curious woman, the perfect witness for a detective. "Sydney left very early yesterday morning," said the elderly woman. "I get up at 6:30 for my morning run and saw her driving out of the garage in her Mercedes. It was dark, but I recognized the car and her silhouette." "What time exactly?" "Around 6:15. I thought it was strange. Sydney doesn't usually get up that early." This changed the case dramatically. Sydney had lied about her alibi, and her departure time coincided with the time of the murder. At 3:30 p.m., Sarah received another important piece of information. Technicians had recovered some of the surveillance camera footage from the residential complex where Roxana lived. The blurry recording showed a woman in a dark coat entering the building at 11:50 p.m. The camera only partially captured her face, but her light hair and elegant posture were clearly visible. More important was the recording from the morning. At 7:25 a.m., the same woman left the building, moving quickly and nervously. This time, the camera captured her face more clearly. Sydney Coleman's profile was recognizable. "We have enough evidence to make an arrest," Sarah told District Attorney Michael Stewart. "A false alibi, purchase of a murder weapon, video footage, witness statements." The prosecutor reviewed the case file. "I agree, but be prepared for a media circus. The arrest of a mayoral candidate's wife for the murder of his mistress is front-page news." At 5 p.m., Sarah and a team of detectives arrived at the Coleman home with an arrest warrant. Sydney met them in the living room, still maintaining a calm exterior, but Sarah noticed the woman's hands were shaking. "Sydney Coleman, you are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Roxana Martinez," Sarah said in an official tone. "You have the right to remain silent." Richard, who was present at the arrest, turned pale as a ghost. "This is impossible. Sydney couldn't have done it." But his wife stopped him with a glance. "Enough, Richard. It's time to stop lying." In the interrogation room at the police station, Sydney sat across from Sarah, maintaining her dignity, even in handcuffs. Her lawyer, Jonathan Price, one of the best criminal defense attorneys in the city, was present. "We know that you bought the gloves that were found at the crime scene," Sarah began. "We have your fingerprints in the victim's apartment and video footage of you entering and leaving the building." Sydney listened silently, showing no emotion. "Your neighbors saw you leaving your home around 6:30 a.m., even though you claimed you were at home. Why did you lie?" The lawyer leaned toward his client and whispered something in her ear, but Sydney shook her head. "I want to tell the truth," she said quietly. "Sydney, I strongly advise you not to," the lawyer began. "No," the woman interrupted him. "Enough lies. I'm tired of hiding." Sarah turned on the tape recorder and prepared to record the confession. "Yes, "I killed Roxana Martinez," Sydney said in an even voice. "I didn't plan it. I planned to meet her, but not to kill her." "Tell me more." Sydney took a deep breath. "When Richard confessed to the affair, I initially thought it was just a fling, a casual relationship that would pass. But then I realized he was truly in love. He was going to destroy our family, his career, my life for the sake of this woman." Her voice trembled, but she continued. "I decided to talk to her in person. I found out her address, called from an anonymous number, and said I wanted to discuss the situation civilly." "What happened in the apartment?" "She was surprisingly calm. She offered me coffee and was polite. We talked about Richard, about how their relationship was destroying my family. I asked her to leave our lives." Sydney fell silent, gathering her strength. "And then she told me the truth, about who she used to be, about her past, and I realized that my husband wasn't just cheating on me. He was willing to destroy everything for it." Sarah saw old pain and rage flash in the woman's eyes. "I brought a gun for self-defense. I didn't know who I was dealing with. When she told me the truth, I don't remember exactly how it happened. I was furious. Not just because of the betrayal, but because of the hypocrisy of it all. Richard, who preaches traditional values, falls in love with her. What happened next?" "I fired. Once. She fell, and I realized what I had done. I was scared and ran away. I threw the gloves in a trash can near the building." The confession was recorded, but Sarah felt that wasn't all. "Why did you lie about your alibi?" "I hoped no one would find out, that it would pass for a robbery or an accidental killing. I didn't think about cameras or fingerprints." The lawyer made desperate attempts to stop his client, but Sydney was adamant. "I devoted 18 years of my life to Richard's career. I gave up my own ambitions, my children, my personal life, all for his success, and he was willing to throw it all away for a man who isn't even who he seems to be." In these words, Sarah heard not only jealousy, but also deep pain from betrayal and the collapse of her life plans. The news of Sydney Coleman's arrest rocked Richmond. Thomas Kane got the scoop of the century. Not only a politician's affair with a transgender woman, but also a murder committed by his wife. The Richmond Tribune came out with huge headlines. "Deadly jealousy. Mayoral candidate's wife kills husband's transgender lover." The story instantly spread across national media outlets: CNN, Fox News, MSNBC. All the major networks sent camera crews to Richmond. The city found itself at the center of a scandal that touched on some of the most painful issues in American society: politics, family values, LGBTQ+ rights, and the challenges faced by transgender people. Richard Coleman's election campaign collapsed instantly. On the day his wife was arrested, he announced that he was withdrawing from the race. At a press conference, he looked like a broken man. "I deeply regret the tragedy that has occurred," he said in a trembling voice. "Roxana was a wonderful person, and she did not deserve to die this way. I also apologize to the people of Richmond for the disappointment I have caused." Sydney Coleman's trial began in March 2025 and became one of the most widely covered in the state's history. The prosecutor charged her with first-degree murder, claiming that the crime was premeditated. The defense insisted on second-degree murder in the heat of passion. A key moment in the trial was the testimony of psychiatrist Dr. Margaret Stone, who examined Sydney. In her opinion, the woman acted in a state of severe emotional distress caused by the collapse of her 20-year marriage and her social status. Mrs. Coleman devoted her entire adult life to supporting her husband's career, Dr. Stone explained to the jury. When she realized that he was willing to destroy everything for an affair that went against their shared beliefs, she had an emotional breakdown. The defense also emphasized that Sydney had no criminal record and was a respected member of the community. Prosecutor Michael Stewart, on the other hand, insisted that the purchase of an anonymous phone and gloves was evidence of premeditation. This was not a spontaneous act of jealousy, he argued. The defendant planned the meeting with the victim, brought a weapon, and devised a plan to conceal the evidence. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Witness testimony, expert reports, and psychological evaluations painted a complex picture of a tragedy in which there were no clear villains or heroes. At the end of May, the jury returned a verdict of second-degree murder. Sidney Coleman was sentenced to 15 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years. She did not shed a tear when the sentence was handed down. Richard, who was present in the courtroom, cried openly. After the trial, the lives of all those involved in the drama changed dramatically. Richard sold his house in Richmond and moved to a small town in North Carolina, where he worked as a consultant for a private firm. His political career was over for good. Thomas Kane received the Pulitzer Prize for his investigative journalism, but admitted to his friends that he felt no joy at his success. "Too many lives were destroyed," he said. Detective Sarah Mitchell was promoted to lieutenant, but the Coleman case remained the most difficult of her career. "Sometimes the truth hurts more than a lie," she reflected. The city's LGBT+ organization established the Roxana Martinez Scholarship for transgender students. Her former colleagues remembered her as a talented professional and a kind person who did not deserve such a tragic death. Democrat James Mitchell won the mayoral election, building his campaign on calls for tolerance and overcoming divisions in society. In his inaugural speech, he said, "The tragedy that shook our city should remind us of the importance of acceptance and understanding of one another." But the scars remained. Richmond struggled for years with the aftermath of a scandal that exposed deep prejudices and divisions in American society. Sidney Coleman's story became the subject of books, documentaries, and public debates about the price of hypocrisy and the destructive power of hatred. What began as a routine political scandal became a tragedy about the price of lies, the power of prejudice, and the devastating consequences of a society's inability to accept human diversity. It reminded America that behind political headlines are real people with pain, hopes, and dreams that can be shattered in an instant.